Hello. This is just a bonus. I enjoyed reading the Sinbad the other day, and I was in the mood to read another one, so I thought I would read it to all of you. And my dog wants to hear it too, so that's important. The second voyage of Sinbad the Sailor. I was leading a highly enjoyable life until one day I was suddenly seized with a longing to travel the world again and to make myself another fortune by trading. And so I took a great purse of gold and bought myself a wealth of merchandise and everything I needed for my voyage and had it all bundled up in great bales. Then I went down to the port and found a gleaming new ship that was just about to leave. She was an impressive vessel with sails made of fine cloth, and she had a first-class crew. Together with some other merchants, I arranged my passage with the captain, and on that very same day our goods were embarked and we set sail. Once again I was excited by the life of travel and commerce. We had a remarkably smooth voyage, sailing from city to city and island to island. Everywhere we landed we were greeted by throngs of distinguished lords and merchants who were very eager to barter and trade with us. At last destiny brought us to an island that was rich in heavily laden fruit trees and heavily scented plants, with no sound but the gentle warbling of birds and the murmur of the streams. Nowhere was there any sign of human habitation. As soon as we dropped anchor, all the sailors and the merchants, myself included, went ashore to enjoy the wonderful greenness of the place. I found myself a spot by a spring of cool water that welled up among the trees and sat down to a meal of the provisions I had brought with me. The breeze was so sweet with the fragrance of all the flowers that soon after I had finished I became drowsy and drifted off into a deep sleep. When I finally awoke, the sun was just beginning to set. To my surprise, I seemed alone. There was no sign of the crew or my fellow merchants. The ship had gone, not again, and no one had given a single thought for me. In despair, I searched the length and breadth of the little island, knowing that my quest was futile. Futile, there's nothing to be done. And indeed, it proved what I knew already. I was totally alone. I beat my breast in misery and cursed myself for having tempted fate by venturing on a second voyage, when it was only by good fortune that I had survived the first. To think that I could have been in my own house in Baghdad, surrounded by my friends, enjoying the best of food and wines with them. And here I was, through my own folly, left to finish my days in utter solitude. I was so distressed that I blundered around the island like a madman. I climbed a tall tree in the desperate hope of seeing signs of human life, but there was nothing but vegetation and sand and sea and sky. But just as I was about to make my descent, I spotted something glistening white in the far distance. Once down from the tree, I collected the rest of my provisions and set out to investigate. It took some time to reach it, but at last I found myself near enough to make out that it was an enormous white globe. It had no openings of any kind on its rounded sides, and it was far too smooth and curved for me to be able to climb up and examine the top. By walking around it, I was able to discover that it was 50 paces in circumference. While I was puzzling over what it could be and how it came to be there, the sunset sky suddenly turned black. At first I thought that a thick cloud must have appeared, but then I realized that a gigantic bird was slowly winging its way toward me and blotting out the sun as it approached. I immediately recalled the traveler's tales of the great roc, the bird that is famed for feeding its young on elephants, and knew that this must be it and the white globe must be its egg. Taking shelter among some fronds, I saw the roc land in the egg and settle with its wings around it protectively as its legs stretched out behind it. Very quietly I crept out from my hiding place, and with trembling hands unwrapped my turban. Twisting it like a rope, I bound it tightly around my waist and tied the ends around one of the roc's legs. It didn't move. My idea was that, on its flight for food the following morning, it would carry me with it and take me within reach of my fellow men. I can tell you I didn't sleep a wink that night for fear that the powerful bird might suddenly take off and catch me unawares. As dawn approached, the roc began to stir and preen itself, and then with a great screech it launched itself into the air with me eyes tightly shut, clinging grimly to my turban rope. The rock swooped and soared until I almost lost consciousness, but finally I felt it making a gentle descent and landing. There it is. There he is, tied on. As soon as my feet made contact with the solid ground, I wasted no time in releasing myself from its leg and diving behind a boulder for cover. But at no time had the great creature shown any awareness of my presence. I must have felt no heavier than a feather. All the same, it was all I could do to stop myself from shaking, and I breathed a deep sigh of relief when I saw it bound forward, seize something in its claws, and rise into the air. To my amazement, I realized that it was clutching an enormous serpent. Despite the size and strength of the great reptile, it writhed helplessly in the iron grip of the rock as it was borne out of sight. Oh, there it goes. Carrying it away, the giant serpent. I suddenly became aware that the rock had left me on a ledge overlooking a deep valley that was surrounded on all sides by towering mountains far too steep for a man to climb. Once again I had reason to curse my stupidity. At least the island would have provided me with nourishing fruits to eat and fresh water to drink, where I was certain to starve to death in this barren wilderness. Clambering down to the floor of the valley in the hope of finding at least some plants to eat, I was amazed to find that the stones that lay scattered all around were in fact diamonds, some of a truly astonishing size. Look how big it is. So that is a giant diamond. Where did I go? Oh my goodness, size. This discovery distracted my mind from my plight for some time, until I became aware of yet another cause for alarm. There, immediately ahead of me, I saw that the caves of the valley were heaving with serpents, so gigantic that the very smallest of them could have swallowed an elephant without difficulty. I reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that during the daylight hours they concealed themselves in the rock and the immense eagles that circled high overhead, but I knew that the valley would not be a safe place for me at night. And so when the sun began to set, I found myself a narrow opening in the rock face and squeezed through, closing the hole behind me with a stone that was just big enough to fill the gap while still letting in a little light. When my eyes grew accustomed to the dim light, my heart nearly failed. At the far end of the narrow cave lay a serpent coiled around her eggs. I had no choice but to remain in the cave all night, for I could hear the constant hissing of the serpent searching for food outside, but I scarcely closed my eyes for sheer terror. As soon as daylight showed through the crack of the entrance, I rolled back the stone and staggered out into the valley, faint with fear and fatigue and hunger. It was while I was stumbling along in this dazed state that a slaughtered sheep came hurtling through the air and crashed down just in front of me. At first I was too amazed to be able to make any sense of what was happening, and then I remembered the stories I had heard of how diamond merchants are said to collect their stones in inaccessible places. They cut the throat of a sheep and skin it, and then they throw it down to the valley. The force with which the carcass strikes the ground causes the diamonds to stick to it. The hungry eagles and vultures quickly spot the bloody meat, swoop down upon it, and carry it up to the mountain summits with the gems still embedded in it. Then the merchants emerge from their hiding places among the boulders, and banging sticks and shouting scare the birds into abandoning their prey. All the merchants have to do then is to wrench the diamonds out of the flesh. Weak and light-headed though I was, I quickly realized that this was my only hope of rescue. Hurriedly filling my pockets, my provision bags, and the folds of my clothes with the largest diamonds that were scattered around, I lay down on my back, hauled the carcass on top of me, and bound myself to it with my unwound turban. In no time at all, an eagle swooped down on the sheep and seized it in its talons. I found myself being lifted high into the air, all the while clinging on for dear life and not daring to look down. The breath was knocked out of me when the eagle reached the summit and dropped the carcass. In preparation for ripping it to shreds, luckily for me, the travelers' tales that I had heard proved to be the truth. A great clattering of wooden sticks and a frenzied shouting sent the bird flapping away from its meal, leaving me free to release myself from the dead sheep. The merchant who came running up turned pale with horror as he saw me emerge, my clothes all blood-stained, from under the meat. But his fear gave way to dismay when he summoned up enough courage to turn the carcass over and found nothing clinging to it. I hastened to reassure him. "Believe me," I said, "I too am a merchant, and an honest man. I have about me more diamonds, and diamonds of far greater value than you have ever seen together before. You shall have enough of them to make your fortune." At this he thanked and blessed me, and summoned all the other merchants who were hiding among the rocks waiting for their carcasses to be returned. We passed that night together in a safe place that they had found, and they listened with wonder at my story of how I had been abandoned on the island and how I had reached the valley. The first merchant declared that I must be truly fortunate, because, he said, no man has ever been known to emerge alive from the Valley of the Serpents, and they all congratulated me on my safe deliverance. The next morning they escorted me through a pass in the mountain range, from where I got frequent glimpses of the giant serpents in the valley below to remind me of my lucky escape. Finally we descended to a port and crossed to the island of Roja. There I was shown a plantation of camphor trees, so immense that 100 men could take shelter under any one of them. The natives collect the camphor by boring into the upper part of the trunk with a long iron rod, causing the liquid camphor, the sap of the tree, to run down the tree into vessels in which it sets like gum. After this the tree dies and is used for firewood. Another remarkable feature of this island is the rhinoceros, a huge creature with a horn on its forehead, 10 cubits long, that reveals the likeness of a man when it is cut in half. Weird. Travelers tell that this beast, which the natives call karkadan, is strong enough to carry off an elephant spiked on its horn, while it peacefully grazes on the leaves and twigs it finds along the coast. However, the elephant finally dies, and the fat of it, melting in the sun, runs down the rhinoceros's eyes, blinding it and causing it to lie down on the shore. This makes it an easy prey for the giant roc, which comes swooping down to carry off the rhinoceros, elephant and all, to feed its young. My question is, why does the rhinoceros do that? Why does it capture an elephant while it's eating weeds, only for the elephant to blind it? I think the rhinoceroses need to rethink this. My companions introduced me to local merchants who had exchanged some of my diamonds for gold and silver, and then we journeyed on from country to country and town to town, all the while trading and bartering, until I finally arrived back home in Baghdad with a great store of diamonds and money and precious goods. I was able to make gifts to all my friends and resumed my former life of entertaining lavishly. Although I was frequently begged to recount the details of my remarkable adventures, the comforts of my new life made me soon forget the sufferings I had endured on my travels. And that is the story of my second voyage. Tomorrow I shall tell you the story of my third. Then, when they had feasted to their heart's content, Sinbad the sailor presented Sinbad the porter with 100 gold dinars, for which the porter thanked him profusely, and had still not finished thanking him by the time he reached home that night. The next day he returned to the merchant's house, as he had been bidden, and when the assembled company was once more in a festive mood, they were treated to the story of the third voyage of Sinbad the sailor. Well, there we go. Hope you enjoyed that.